Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. Today, once again, we'll be delving into this mystery of the esoteric Plato. The theory put forth basically by a group of scholars at Germany's University of Tübingen, starting in the late 1950s, that Plato's philosophy formed a system, but one that could only really be understood with the help of a sort of mathematical mysticism that he never wrote explicitly about in his dialogues, but supposedly taught to his closest followers at his school in Athens, the Academy. You might remember that last episode I set out some of the key points put forward by the Tübingen scholars to support their position. Well, some scholars of ancient Greek philosophy say, I'm paraphrasing here, but they basically say that there are holes in this theory big enough to row a trireme through. And today I'd like to look at some of these counter arguments. One thing I mentioned last time is that it's fair to say there's really more than just one Tübingen interpretation, as every scholar tends to bring their own perspective to it naturally. And I think this is probably even more true of the criticisms of this interpretation, partly because as criticisms tend to generally, they come from more than just one direction. And of course, we'd be talking about several decades worth of scholarship. So I think it'd be pointless in a way for me to attempt to be exhaustive here and try to cover everything that's been said against this theory in one episode of my video series. What I'd like to do instead is draw pretty heavily on this paper I mentioned 2 episodes ago called Plato in Tübingen, and it was published in 2006 and written by Columbia University professor Wolfgang Rainer Mann. Mann's paper has the advantages of being relatively recent and also at just shy of 50 pages, pretty in depth, besides being thought-provoking in itself, I think. Not to mention, I almost want to say, frequently entertaining as invective. Among the many digs it gets in, for example, is a refusal to even accept that the Tübingen scholars created a controversy. He writes at one point, quote, "It is actually misleading to speak of controversy here. The Tübingen school is a fringe phenomenon, and its claims are mostly just ignored quietly rather than being rejected explicitly." Anyway, besides that lovely invective, Mann's paper, I think, is also to some extent a useful summary of the various layers of criticism that have been piled onto this idea of an esoteric Plato since it came out, or even, as I mentioned last time, really since before it came out, as it incorporates much of what Harold Chernus, whom I talked a fair bit about last time, had written back in the 1940s against these earlier ideas of an esoteric Plato. And so I'll also be drawing a fair bit from Chernus here as well. And one of these points of Chernus that Mann's paper incorporates is actually directed against the first thing I mentioned 2 episodes ago as evidence brought forward in support of the esoteric Plato. Aristotle's kind of seemingly casual mention in his book, The Physics, of Plato's agrapha dogmata, or unwritten doctrines, and Chernus preferred to refer to them as unwritten opinions. Mann reminds us that way back in his 1942 lectures, just before he volunteered for the army, Chernus argued that Aristotle in this same passage also says that what Plato is saying in this example of his unwritten teachings is the same thing, though expressed in different words, as Plato had written in his book, the Timaeus. So Chernus says, if the written and unwritten teachings correspond in this particular instance, but they're just expressed in different words, but the same idea, why might they not correspond at more or less every point? Why might his dialogues not be a more or less essentially accurate representation of what he told his students at the academy? Or is it possible the dialogues may even have been teaching materials he used there? Not to mention, Mann says, the casual way Aristotle mentions Plato's unwritten doctrines doesn't seem suggestive of anything secret, and here's Mann on this. In the one passage where Aristotle actually uses the expression agrapha dogmata, he precisely does not suggest that there is any substantive difference between the unwritten teachings and the dialogue he mentions. On the contrary, he takes doctrinal overlap for granted. Now, from this we obviously cannot infer that everything referred to under the heading of Plato's unwritten teachings matches up with something in the dialogues, but we can conclude that such overlap is by no means ruled out. Still less are we entitled to conclude that the agrapha dogmata qua unwritten had any sort of special status, e.g., to be communicated only to insiders, different from that of the written dialogues. Indeed, it seems that Aristotle is saying no more about Plato than what we might say when speaking of one of our colleagues, were we to note something like, what she discusses in her published articles under the heading of XYZ, she regularly discusses in her lectures in quite different terminology. So that's man. And I think it's worth noting that every professor who publishes is going to have unwritten doctrines in that sense, simply because you can't possibly publish every single thing you say to your students. You might remember another bit of Tübingen evidence I brought up 2 episodes ago, this very strange thing that Aristotle said in his Metaphysics about Plato teaching that the principles of everything were the one and something called the indefinite dyad, which were also the principles of good and evil. Here again, I think the classic rebuttal, also adduced by Mann, comes from Chernus's wartime lectures. Aristotle, Chernus says, actually frequently misrepresented Plato, and did so here again in his Metaphysics, because he wanted to better set them up to refute them. And this, Chernus says, is generally Aristotle's modus operandi when writing of what earlier philosophers said. Basically, he translates what they said into Aristotelian terms, or really rather mistranslates what they said into Aristotelian terms, with the unspoken implication being that their thoughts needed to be put into his terms in order to be clearly expressed, and then shows how, expressed in these terms, their arguments don't hold up. And he brings examples of Aristotle doing the same thing elsewhere. And Chernus says, and this I think is sort of delightfully put, quote, Aristotle is one of those who cannot be refuted by an author's words because he is sure that the author was unable to say what he really thought. So only Aristotle is really able to express what the author had in mind. And then once it's put into Aristotle's terms, it can be easily knocked down by Aristotelian logic. You might remember I also mentioned 2 episodes ago this anecdote mentioned by Aristoxenus, one of Aristotle's students. According to Aristoxenus, Aristotle used to tell this story of Plato giving a public lecture that confounded all his hearers, which was supposed to be on the good, but ended up being largely about mathematics, and concluded with the idea that the one, the unity of being, but also the principle of all number, right? So the unit is the building block of all number. And the good, the one and the good are the same. Again, the classic response, repeated by Mann, is from Chernus. If Plato said these things in a public lecture, they could hardly have been secret or intended only for an elite, for Plato's closest followers at the academy. Moving on to the next bit of Tübingen evidence I mentioned last time, this disdain Socrates shows for written teaching in the Platonic dialogue Phaedrus. He mentions at one point that philosophers will always have more valuable things that aren't in their written works, that they hold in reserve to come to their aid, by which the Tübingen scholars understood the unwritten principles, so to come to their aid in philosophical argument. Here, Mann, citing Gregory Vlastos, whom we also have mentioned before, says that Plato can't be referring to some secret doctrine. Vlastos had written that it's not a special knowledge, of secret principles, for example, that the philosopher will bring to his aid in his spoken teaching, the back and forth of dialectic that is Socrates' method, but something really quite common, something not arcane, the kinds of everyday things Socrates is always talking about. And in any case, Mann says, what really sets Socrates apart isn't that he possesses some knowledge no one else knows, but that he knows how not to contradict himself. I also mentioned the so-called seventh letter, possibly written by Plato, in which the writer talks about never having written down anything about the subject to which he devotes himself, because it's not really capable of being put into words. Chernus's response is simply to say that the seventh letter was a forgery. Mann doesn't necessarily think so, but if I understand him here, the underlying issue that the seventh letter raises is the question of Plato's motivation for supposedly not wanting to talk about the principle or principles of his philosophy. And Plato's supposed motivation is something that Mann addresses in some detail. So if he didn't want to repeat this to propagate this to a wide audience, why not? He spends a lot of the paper basically trying to isolate possible reasons why the principles should not be expressed in writing, but can't find ones that seem satisfactory. For example, if Plato thought these principles were too hard for a wide audience to understand, would he really have written such profoundly difficult and often highly enigmatic dialogues like Parmenides, Theaetetus, or Sophist? There are just so many other things in the dialogues, Mann says, which seem vulnerable to being misunderstood. And he writes, given how difficult it is, in the case of each of them, to determine how it should be understood correctly, it seems that if Plato were so concerned about his thought being misconstrued, he should not write or say anything at all. Or to put this, and by the way, that's his exclamation point there. Or to put this in a slightly different way, what could the content of the supposed oral teaching be that it proves to be so much more susceptible to being misunderstood than anything else, Plato says? And when Mann finally comes to the content of that oral teaching, according to the Tübingen scholars, it seems to him an astonishingly simple concept for something supposedly so vulnerable to being misunderstood. He quotes Geiser's short paragraph summing up Plato's teaching on the one and the indefinite dyad, and then he writes, quote, at this point, I cannot help but wonder, is that all there is? Shades of Peggy Lee, he writes in parentheses, and I had to Google this, but it's from a 1969 song. Is this what has to be held back so that it will not be misunderstood or misinterpreted? Is this what it takes years and years of practice in the presence of the true philosopher, Plato himself, to learn properly? This question of Plato's motivation is what Mann says is his biggest worry about the Tübingen position. And yet, actually, I wonder a bit if it might really be his second biggest worry, because part of me suspects his true biggest worry, and perhaps the biggest worry generally of the Tübingen scholars' opponents, is that the Tübingen position seems to involve an understanding of philosophy that seems objectionable, even anathema to them. They see the Tübingen scholars as having this idea that the summit, as it were, of Platonic philosophical teaching is a kind of mystery that the student must accept in an essentially passive, perhaps even blind way, something that seems to fly in the face of everything that Socrates stood for, even perhaps, though Mann doesn't say this, what he died for, his role as this irritating yet liberating gadfly of the people of Athens. Mann writes, what is most striking about such a model is how unsocratic it is. Socrates, i.e. Plato's Socrates, goes out of his way not to impart any body of doctrines, Rather, he subjects the views of his interlocutors to a kind of critical scrutiny to test both whether those views are consistent and whether his interlocutors are in a position to uphold them consistently. But the Tübingen scholars for Mann seem to see Plato's philosophy almost in the opposite way, even as a kind of self-abasing cult, a cult that encourages or requires self-abasement in some way, because he writes, it seems that the relationship between Plato and his associates is not that of, say, teacher and advanced students, but instead resembles that of a hierophant and his acolytes. If one takes a rather different view of philosophy and philosophical teaching from the one that it seems the Tübingen school takes, one will have rather different expectations of what would count for Plato as success in his teaching, if there even was such a thing. That is to say, why should we hold that Plato wanted his students to absorb Platonic doctrines rather than engage in creative philosophical research for themselves? Mann's research interests, according to his page on the Columbia University website, include theories of argumentation, beginning with Socrates and Plato. But intriguingly to me, he's also done work on English and German Romanticism, Wordsworth and Hölderlin. And it's perhaps unsurprising, I think, given these latter interests, that Mann is not dismissive of the idea of ecstatic vision, and of course can't deny that it plays some role in Plato's philosophy. And we'll certainly see that a little later in the symposium, for example. But he clearly finds offensive the idea that such visions are essential to philosophy, and therefore absurd this notion advanced by Geyser that Aristotle did not become a Platonist because he didn't experience a Platonic ecstasy himself, which I must say does seem a bit of a stretch to me also, actually. Not to mention the idea that Aristotle isn't a Platonist, at least in some sense, which a lot of people have often thought. He was, even though he broke away from Platonism, he kept a lot of what was essential about it. And I do think ecstasy actually is in some sense central to the Aristotelian system. There's, of course, this notion of the highest reality being a kind of ecstasy in Book 12 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and that this is, in a way, the ultimate cause, that desire for this divine joy is, in a way, and it sounds strange to us, of course, in our scientific age, it's the primary motive behind natural processes. The love that, in the words of Dante, that unforgettable final line of the Divine Comedy, moves the sun and the other stars. Anyway, Geyser's suggestion that Aristotle wasn't a Platonist because he never had this vision, Mann says, is, quote, ridiculous, and is, he writes, quote, based on the most tenuous of speculations. It is also thoroughly unphilosophical, indeed anti-philosophical. On that note, it's perhaps time to move on. You may remember that 2 episodes ago, when I was talking about the evidence brought up by the Tübingen side, I mentioned there was a lot I had to pass over just in the interest of time. Well, the same thing certainly applies to the other side also, and I'm going to skip over a lot simply because we can't stay on this controversy forever. So just 2 quick thoughts to end this episode with. One is that I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to share on this controversy. Do you feel yourself leaning one way or the other, and why? I'd love to read any thoughts that you have time to share on that. And the other thought is just to give you a sense of where I'd like to head next with this series. Having presented both sides, I'd like to move on to questions like these. What might be the underlying reason or reasons for the startling level of mutual antagonism the Tübingen thesis generated, and that I basically spent a whole episode on a few episodes ago? Where does this controversy seem likely to go? Could there be a way beyond the impasse that it seems to have reached? I actually think there is, And it will have a lot of bearing on the theme of this whole series, which is, of course, how Platonic love can change your life. So that's where I'd like to go next. And I hope you can join me next week. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.